The morning the HOA president rolled onto my ranch with a convoy of heavy equipment and a stack of fake emergency paperwork was the morning she learned the difference between intimidation and suicide. My stubborn rancher. She strutted across my driveway like she owned the soil under her polished heels, demanded I demolish my family's century-old barn within 24 hours, and insulted my grandfather while she was at it. When threats didn't work, she sent her little enforcement squad on my property, and when that failed, she cut my fencing in the middle of the night, nearly sending my horses straight into highway traffic. She thought she'd picked an easy target. What she didn't realize was that I'm not just a rancher. I'm a civil engineer, and eventually I discovered her entire HOA kingdom sat on land she didn't legally control. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Damian Wright. I grew up believing soil has more honesty in it than most people ever will. Dirt tells you when it's exhausted, when it needs water, and when something unfamiliar has crossed over it. People, though, people can shake your hand while planning how to take your livelihood. My grandfather taught me that lesson right here on Wright Ranch, 160 stubborn acres in Blackwood County that have belonged to my family for 4 generations. He used to tell me, character is like a fence post. Either it holds firm during storms or it rots quietly until the wind barely has to touch it. I built my life trying to stand like those fence posts. I earned a civil engineering degree, worked construction infrastructure projects, but I always returned home. The ranch wasn't just property. It was a bone-deep identity. So when Karen Lewin's immaculate white SUV sprayed dust across my driveway, I already sensed trouble was coming. Karen was the reigning queen of Blackwood Creek Estates, a manicured subdivision planted beside my ranch about 10 years earlier, like an invasive plant species that spread too fast for anyone to stop. She stepped out dressed like she was hosting a charity luncheon. Linen pressed, smile stretched tight enough to crack porcelain. Standing beside her was a county employee named Peters, who looked like a man who'd accidentally walked into the wrong funeral. I leaned against my gate, tractor grease still staining my hands, and waited. "Damien," she sang, dripping syrupy politeness. "We have a minor compliance issue." She waved a thick envelope toward my barn. My barn, the structure my great-grandfather raised from timber he harvested himself. The place where my grandfather taught me rope work, weather reading, and life lessons you don't find in textbooks. "That building," she said, flicking her wrist dismissively, "has been flagged as structurally dangerous." I stared at Peters. Sweat rolled down his temple as he refused eye contact. "I'm a licensed civil engineer," I said slowly. "That building's been standing longer than your subdivision's been a sketch on paper." Karen's smile hardened. "The county has determined your property is an immediate public safety hazard. My entire property, barn, fencing, sheds, everything." She clipped an official-looking notice onto my gate. "Emergency abatement order, 24 hours to begin demolition." If I didn't comply, her HOA could legally demolish the buildings and bill me, placing a lien on my ranch large enough to bury me financially. It wasn't paperwork. It was warfare with letterhead. "You can't be serious," I told her. "It's not personal," she replied sweetly. "It's community safety." Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Your grandfather refused our offers too. Look where that stubbornness left him." That was the moment she crossed from opponent to enemy. They drove off, leaving the notice flapping on my fence like a death warrant. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, staring at that paper, hearing echoes of my grandfather hammering nails into barn beams decades earlier. Then the shock burned off. Anger replaced it. And anger, when paired with engineering logic, becomes something extremely dangerous. I ran inside and called the only person who could help immediately, my friend Dave. Dave wasn't a lawyer. He owned a repair shop in town and had a PhD in local gossip networks. "She gave you how long?" he yelled. 24 hours. She's finally snapped. He gave me the contact info for Margaret Shunn, a lawyer known for dismantling HOA overreach cases. Margaret listened carefully as I dumped the entire story in under 2 minutes. "This isn't aggressive," she said. "It's illegal. I'm filing for an emergency injunction, but you need to stall them if they show up." "Ow! You're an engineer," she said. Figure something out. The next morning, I parked at my driveway entrance before sunrise, coffee thermos in hand, adrenaline keeping me wide awake. At 6:15 a.m., I heard engines. 2 bulldozers, a backhoe, and demolition trucks rolled toward my property like a slow mechanical invasion force. Karen followed behind them, glowing with victory. "Step aside," she said cheerfully. "Injunction hearing is at 10, I replied. She laughed. "Begin demolition," she ordered. The bulldozer rumbled forward. I stepped directly in front of it. Every vibration from that machine traveled up through my boots into my spine. "You crossed this gate without a court order," I shouted, "and I will sue every individual standing here personally." I held up my phone and bluffed. "My lawyer just confirmed a restraining order 15 minutes ago." Silence. The operator killed the engine. The foreman hesitated. Then Karen's phone rang. Her expression collapsed as she read the screen. "We'll be back," she spat. "Looking forward to it," I said. 10 seconds after the convoy disappeared, my phone buzzed. "Temporary restraining order granted." Nice stalling tactic. I collapsed into the dirt, shaking with relief. Round 1 was mine. But Karen Lewin was not finished. Not even close. Over the next weeks, harassment replaced demolition attempts. HOA volunteers hovered near my property, taking photographs. Residents started telling stories about her tyrannical enforcement habits, finding widows, threatening young couples, denying accessibility ramps. Then she escalated. She came after my horses. It happened on a quiet Tuesday night. I woke to panicked whinnying, the unmistakable sound of terrified animals running blind. By the time I reached the pasture, the gate was open and the fence along the county highway had been cleanly cut with bolt cutters. My horses were gone. I ran barefoot across the field and burst through tree cover just as Apollo bolted onto the highway and a semi-truck rounded the curve. The driver slammed brakes. Scout slammed into Apollo and shoved him off the road seconds before impact. The truck screeched past. I nearly collapsed from relief. When I inspected the fence, I found 2 things: a precise boot print and a torn scrap of blue uniform fabric. I photographed everything. Karen had just escalated this into criminal territory, and I decided I was done playing defense. The next morning, I drove to the county records office, because power doesn't always sit on the surface. Sometimes it hides in paperwork older than the people causing problems. After hours digging through property plats and lease agreements, I found something extraordinary. The HOA didn't own the land under its own clubhouse, pool, and rental townhomes. They were leasing it, and that lease was about to expire. That was when my real plan began forming. Not to fight Karen, to outflank her completely. Once I realized the HOA's most valuable assets were sitting on land they didn't actually own, the entire battlefield shifted. Karen thought she controlled power through bylaws and intimidation tactics. But the real power was buried in decades-old paperwork, the kind nobody checks until it's too late. And I just found it. The lease agreement dated back to 1978. A family named Alamy had sold most of their farmland to developers, but they kept ownership of one crucial 5-acre parcel. Instead of selling it outright, they leased it to the subdivision builders under a 50-year ground lease. That parcel held everything that made the HOA functional. The clubhouse, the swimming pool, tennis courts, the administrative office, an entire row of rental townhomes. The HOA didn't own the ground beneath those buildings. They were tenants. Even better, the lease contained a clause stating that once the contract expired, the leaseholder could renegotiate rent at full market value, or terminate the agreement entirely, claiming ownership of all structures built on that land. It was the legal equivalent of holding the keys to someone else's castle. Tracking down the Alamy heirs turned out to be easier than expected. The original landowners had passed away years earlier, leaving the lease rights split between their 3 children, 2 sisters living in Florida and a brother in Arizona. I called them personally. I didn't pitch it like a business deal. I told them the truth about the demolition order, the sabotage, the harassment, and my family's history tied to the land. Something about that story hit home. After discussing it among themselves, They agreed to sell me the lease rights. Then they told me the price. Even discounted, it was far beyond what I had. I started selling everything that wasn't nailed down. Stocks disappeared first, then equipment, the cattle trailer, post drivers, backup generators. The hardest sale was my grandfather's John Deere tractor, a 1968 model he bought brand new. Letting it go felt like erasing part of our family timeline. Old man Henderson from a neighboring ranch bought it and promised to hold it for me if I ever wanted it back. Even after all that, I was still short. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the numbers when my phone rang. Damien Wright? Yes. This is Trevor Hale. Henderson suggested I call. I knew exactly who he was. Trevor Hale was a reclusive tech billionaire who had retired locally. Rumors said he rarely involved himself in community matters. I understand you're attempting to purchase a certain ground lease, he said calmly, and you've encountered a funding gap. We met the following day at a quiet coffee shop. Trevor listened without interrupting while I explained everything from Karen's demolition stunt to the horse incident. When I finished, he stirred his coffee slowly and said one sentence that told me everything. I have a personal dislike for bullies. He opened a checkbook. This isn't a loan, he said. It's an investment. I'll provide the remaining capital for a 49% share. You maintain majority control. My only condition is simple. He looked me dead in the eye. When the time comes, don't go easy on them. The deal moved forward quietly. We formed Blackwood Land Holdings LLC to purchase the lease. To avoid tipping anyone off, we hired attorneys from outside the county and scheduled the transaction through private wire transfers. For a moment, everything looked perfect. Then Karen caught wind of it. 3 days before closing, the eldest Alamus sister called me, sounding shaken. Mr. Wright, an attorney representing the HOA, contacted us. She claims selling the lease violates the original agreement. It doesn't, I replied. Our lawyer confirmed that, but she also said the HOA is prepared to offer significantly more money than you did. My stomach dropped. Karen wasn't just reacting anymore. She was trying to beat me to the finish line. I called Trevor immediately. She's attempting a preemptive buyout, he said flatly. If they secure the lease first, they'll bury ownership disputes in litigation for years. You lose leverage permanently. My transfer is scheduled for tomorrow morning. That's not fast enough, he said. Meet your bank when they open. Every minute counts. I barely slept that night. By sunrise, I was pacing my house like a caged animal. By 8:15 a.m., I was already standing outside my bank waiting for the doors to unlock. The branch manager, Susan, looked startled when she saw me waiting like it was a Black Friday electronics sale. I need to authorize a wire transfer immediately, I told her. She nodded. Mr. Hale's office has already finalized approvals. I signed paperwork faster than I thought humanly possible. When does it happen? I asked. Processing now. She clicked her keyboard. Completed. Timestamp, 8:33 a.m. My knees nearly gave out from relief. 5 minutes later, I called Florida. Did the funds arrive? Yes, she said. And Mr. Right? 2 minutes after your transfer cleared, another wire arrived from the HOA's legal firm. Much larger than yours. 2 minutes. That was the margin between victory and complete defeat. We're rejecting their offer, she said. The lease belongs to you. For the first time since Karen showed up at my gate, I felt calm. Not relieved. Calm. Because the entire chessboard had just flipped. Karen still thought she was playing offense. She didn't realize she'd just walked straight into checkmate territory. Owning the ground lease felt like sitting at a poker table holding a royal flush while everyone else believed you were bluffing. I didn't act immediately. I waited. For an entire week. While Karen and the HOA board scrambled to figure out what had happened, Dave and I started building something in my workshop. A sign. Not a small sign. A massive, 8-foot-wide declaration designed to detonate maximum panic. Letters need to be bigger, Dave said while sanding plywood edges. Make them louder, I replied. Like legal paperwork screaming in neon. He grinned. So, basically, polite terror. Exactly. We painted it bright white with giant red lettering. Professional. Legal-looking. Terrifying. 3 nights later, under darkness, we installed the sign at the entrance of the HOA's rental townhome complex, which now sat on my land. Then we slipped official-looking notices under every tenant door. Not eviction notices. Just vague tenancy review statements drafted by my lawyer to stay technically legal while still causing maximum confusion. The next morning, I parked across the street with coffee and pastries Dave insisted were necessary for entertainment purposes. The show started around 7:45 a.m. A commuter slammed his brakes, reading the sign. Then his wife ran outside waving one of the notices and screaming loud enough to wake half the subdivision. Within 20 minutes, residents flooded the entrance wearing bathrobes, business suits, and pajamas, shouting into phones, arguing with neighbors, panicking over rent increases they didn't fully understand. It was controlled chaos. Exactly what I wanted. At 8:30 a.m., Karen arrived. She didn't park. She nearly crashed while pulling over. The moment she read the sign, her face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and nuclear rage. Then she spotted me leaning against my truck, holding a folder of property documents. She marched toward me like she was trying to drill holes into the pavement with her heels. "What is this?" she demanded. I took a slow sip of coffee. "Good morning, Karen. Lovely day for property management." Karen stopped just a few feet away from me, chest rising and falling like she'd sprinted a mile in heels. Up close, I could see the cracks forming in her perfect composure. "Remove that sign immediately," she snapped. "And those notices you distributed are fraudulent. I can have you arrested for this." I calmly set my coffee on the hood of my truck and opened the folder tucked under my arm. "Fraud is a strong word," I said. "Those documents are tenancy review notifications. Entirely lawful." I made sure my attorney double-checked the wording. Her jaw tightened. "You are deliberately inciting panic among our residents." I shrugged lightly. I prefer to think of it as transparent communication. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're out of your depth, Damien. You think buying one lease makes you powerful." I pulled out a certified copy of the recorded transfer deed and held it up where both she and the gathering crowd could see it. "It makes me the legal landowner beneath every building behind you." The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel physical. Residents started murmuring. Someone whispered, "Is that real?" Another asked, "Does that mean he controls our leases?" Karen snatched the document from my hand and scanned it. Her face drained of color as recognition dawned. "This is temporary," she said weakly. "No, irreplaceable. It's very permanent." A man in a business suit pushed forward through the crowd, clutching one of the notices. "My rent is increasing tenfold. Are we being evicted?" I raised my hand. "The increase is under legal review. Existing leases remain valid for now, but future agreements and renewal terms will be negotiated through Blackwood Land Holdings." I paused deliberately. "You may want to ask your HOA leadership why this situation exists." That statement hit like gasoline on fire. Voices erupted around Karen. "You told us everything was secure. You said you handled property agreements. What did you do?" Karen spun toward me, her eyes blazing. "You're weaponizing these people." I leaned in slightly, my voice quiet enough only she could hear. "You weaponized your authority first." The confrontation ended with her storming back toward her SUV while residents followed her, demanding answers. I drove away feeling something new settle in my chest. Not revenge, resolution. The scales were balancing. Within 3 days, my lawyer called. "The HOA board has requested an emergency negotiation meeting," Margaret said. "They're desperate." "Good," I replied. The meeting was scheduled at the subdivision clubhouse, a building that now technically sat on property owned by me. I arrived deliberately late. 7 board members sat around a polished conference table. Karen occupied the center seat, though she looked like she'd aged 10 years in 1 week. The others looked terrified of financial collapse. I remained standing. "Good evening," I said. "I'm Damien Wright, managing partner of Blackwood Land Holdings. Your landlord." The HOA treasurer, Arthur, cleared his throat. "Mr. Wright, your proposed rental adjustments are predatory. A 1,000% increase is unsustainable." I smiled slightly. "You're correct. I cannot legally apply those terms to residential tenants immediately. That was simply an attention mechanism. Relief visibly passed across several faces. Then I continued. However, the master commercial lease is entirely renegotiable under the 1978 agreement. The current payment is $12,000 annually. I slid new documents across the table. The revised rate will be $120,000 per month. The room exploded into outrage. That's extortion. You'll bankrupt the association. This is insane. I allowed the noise to run its course before raising one finger. That totals approximately $1.4 million annually. Combined with future townhome revenue transitions, your association's deficit will approach $2 million per year. The board members exchanged horrified glances. Karen leaned forward, her voice low and venomous. What do you want? I placed a single document in the center of the table. A legally binding covenant agreement. 3 conditions. I raised one finger. First, Wright Ranch will be permanently exempt from all HOA regulations and jurisdiction. Forever. Another finger. Second, the HOA will fund full historical restoration of my barn to structural and preservation standards. Then the third. Third, the HOA president will deliver a public apology at a community assembly. The statement will be written by me and include acknowledgement of falsified reports, harassment, and acts of sabotage. Karen shot to her feet. Absolutely not. I remained perfectly calm. You have 72 hours to decide. After that, the commercial lease adjustment becomes effective. I gathered my documents and walked out. 2 days later, Margaret called again. They voted, she said, 6-1 in favor of your conditions. Karen was the lone opposing vote. She'd just been overruled by her own board. The covenant was signed and notarized within 48 hours. Restoration contractors were scheduled. Financial compensation was secured. All that remained was the apology. The community assembly took place in the local high school auditorium. Nearly every homeowner attended. The tension in the room felt electric. Hundreds of residents demanding answers for the financial chaos threatening their neighborhood. I sat beside Dave in the second row. You sure you don't want popcorn? He whispered. I'm good, I replied quietly. After preliminary announcements, the treasurer approached the microphone. As part of a legal settlement resolving recent land lease disputes, HOA President Karen Lewin will deliver a formal statement. Karen walked to the podium slowly. She looked smaller without authority backing her posture. Her hands trembled as she unfolded a sheet of paper. Then she began reading. I, Karen Lewin, acting in my role as HOA president, engaged in a targeted harassment campaign against Mr. Damian Wright. Gasps rippled through the audience. I knowingly relied on falsified inspection documentation to initiate demolition proceedings against his historic family property. More murmurs. Anger building. I authorized unauthorized entry onto private property and supported intimidation tactics, which endangered livestock and motorists. That line wasn't part of my draft. I glanced toward Margaret, who nodded slightly. The HOA's legal team had expanded the statement to limit liability exposure. Karen continued reading, her voice weakening with each sentence. My actions placed the entire Blackwood Creek community at severe legal and financial risk. She lowered the paper slightly, visibly struggling to maintain composure. I formally apologized to Mr. Wright and to every resident impacted by my abuse of authority. The silence lasted only seconds. Then the shouting began. You lied to us. You almost cost us our homes. Resign. The chant built rapidly. Resign. 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 Karen stood frozen at the podium as the sound swallowed the auditorium. That's when Sheriff Mark Dugan stepped forward from the back entrance. The room fell quiet as he approached the stage. Mrs. Lewin, he said evenly, I need to speak with you regarding evidence connected to falsified county documentation and vandalism reports. Her face turned ashen. You may come voluntarily, he continued, or I can make this formal here. Karen nodded numbly. She walked off the stage beside him while hundreds of residents watched in stunned silence. Karen never came back to another HOA meeting. Within a week of the assembly, official charges were filed. The investigation moved quickly once county auditors began reviewing every complaint she had submitted during her presidency. What they uncovered wasn't just misconduct, it was a pattern. Inspection reports altered, violation notices selectively enforced, legal filings submitted with fabricated supporting documentation. The barn demolition order became the centerpiece of the case. Forensic review showed the photographs attached to the condemnation report had been digitally altered to exaggerate structural damage. The contractor who claimed the barn was beyond salvage quietly admitted he had never conducted a full inspection at all. He'd signed off based solely on Karen's directive. That confession cracked the entire case open. Civil lawsuits followed almost immediately. Several homeowners filed claims against the HOA for financial mismanagement and deceptive disclosures. The association's insurance provider refused to cover damages tied to deliberate misconduct, leaving the board scrambling to contain losses. Within a month, 3 additional board members resigned. Emergency elections were held under supervision from county regulators. The new leadership ran on one platform: rebuild trust and stabilize finances, even if that meant cooperating fully with me. Especially if it meant cooperating with me. Meanwhile, restoration on my barn began. The first morning contractors arrived, I stood near the pasture fence watching them unload scaffolding and lumber. The smell of fresh-cut timber drifted through the air, mixing with the familiar scent of hay and soil. For the first time since Karen issued that demolition order, I felt something loosen inside my chest. The restoration crew specialized in historic agricultural structures. They cataloged every surviving beam, salvaged original hardware, and reinforced the foundation while preserving the barn's original footprint. They even found pencil markings from my grandfather inside one of the support posts. Livestock tallies for 1972. The restoration team carefully sealed the markings beneath a protective resin layer. Dave ran his hand over the post and shook his head. "Your granddad would have liked this," he said. I nodded, unable to trust my voice for a moment. The HOA upheld every term of the covenant. The restoration costs were paid in full. Wright Ranch was permanently removed from all regulatory jurisdiction. No future board could challenge that agreement without dissolving the entire association, something their attorneys made clear would be catastrophic. Ironically, the ranch that Karen tried to erase became the one property in the subdivision completely immune to HOA authority. Trevor Hale visited once during construction. He walked the property quietly, hands in his jacket pockets, studying the progress with thoughtful interest. "You handle the endgame differently than most would," he said eventually. "How so?" "You dismantled their power structure instead of destroying it outright." I leaned against the fence, watching horses move across the pasture. Burning everything down would have hurt a lot of people who had nothing to do with Karen's decisions. Trevor smiled faintly. "Majority control suits you," he said. "And for what it's worth, Henderson tells me your tractor is still waiting if you ever want it back." That might have been the best news I'd heard all year. Karen's criminal case stretched nearly 9 months. She ultimately accepted a plea agreement covering document fraud, unlawful property interference, and filing false municipal reports. The sentence included probation, financial penalties, and permanent disqualification from holding any elected community governance position in the state. The legal system handled punishment. I didn't need to. Life at the ranch slowly returned to normal. The new barn doors were installed in early spring. When the final scaffolding came down, I stood in the pasture at sunrise, looking at the finished structure glowing amber in morning light. It looked exactly like it had when I was a kid. Maybe stronger, definitely louder in memory. That afternoon, Dave pulled into the driveway, towing a familiar green trailer behind his truck. I walked outside, squinting against the sun. "You didn't," I started. Old man Henderson stepped out of the passenger seat grinning like he'd been holding on to a secret for years. "Figured it was time to come home," he said. Behind the trailer sat my grandfather's 1968 John Deere, freshly polished, engine rebuilt, paint restored to factory shine. I just stared at it for a long moment. "I told you I was keeping it safe," Henderson added. I ran my hand across the steering wheel. feeling grooves worn smooth by decades of use. Some things weren't meant to be replaced. That evening, neighbors from outside the HOA, ranchers, farmers, and families who'd known my grandfather, gathered for a small cookout near the barn. No speeches, no ceremonies, just food, laughter, and the quiet comfort of shared history. As the sun dipped below the tree line, string lights flickered on across the barn rafters. Music drifted from an old radio balanced on a hay bale. Dave leaned beside me holding 2 bottles of root beer. "You ever think about selling development right now that land values exploded?" he asked casually. I took a slow drink before answering. "Not a chance." He smirked. "Good. I'd hate living next to a golf course." Later that night, after everyone left, I walked through the barn alone. Crickets hummed outside. Wind rustled the pasture grass through the open loft windows. I stopped beside the support post with my grandfather's preserve markings and rested my hand against the wood. Karen thought land was just leverage, just numbers on contracts and revenue projections. She never understood what she was really fighting. Land holds memories. It holds a legacy. And sometimes, it holds the patience to wait out people who mistake authority for ownership. That I stepped outside as the last porch light flickered on at the ranch house. The horses shifted quietly in the field, silhouetted against the moonlit pasture. For the first time in a long while, there were no legal battles waiting. No inspectors. No threats hidden inside certified envelopes. Just open land stretching beneath a quiet sky. And for me, that was always the real victory.